You hear it before you feel it. Not an alarm, not an explosion, just a sound, a low, resonant tick, like someone tapping a wine glass with a fingernail, except the wine glass is the only thing standing between you and 1,086 bars of pressure. That number, 1,086 bars, doesn't mean much until you do the math. At sea level, the atmosphere presses on your body at about 1 bar, roughly 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 11 kilometers down, in the throat of the Challenger Deep, the pressure is 15,750 pounds per square inch. Every square inch of that window is holding back the weight equivalent of a pickup truck. And you just heard the window crack. You have no idea yet that you're already dead. Before we walk through what's about to happen to you, second by second, you need to understand what 11 kilometers of ocean actually means. The Challenger Deep sits at approximately 10,935 meters beneath the Pacific Ocean, a depth so extreme that Mount Everest could be submerged inside it with over a kilometer of water still above the summit. The pressure down here, 1,086 bars, 15,750 pounds per square inch, isn't just uncomfortable. It is physically incompatible with human life outside of an engineered hull. Your submersible maintains 1 atmosphere of internal pressure, exactly what you'd breathe at sea level. That is the only reason you're alive. The differential, the gap between inside and outside, is 1,085 bars. That's 1,085 times the force of the entire sky pressing down on every surface of that window all at once. The viewport isn't glass, it's borosilicate or acrylic, specifically tapered, wider on the outside than the inside, so that hydrostatic pressure, the force of a fluid exerted equally in all directions at a given depth, actually seats the window tighter as depth increases. But a crack changes everything, because once the geometry of that seal is compromised, the pressure doesn't wait. It doesn't hesitate. And here's something most people don't know. The crack itself won't widen slowly like a breaking car windshield. At this pressure, a structural failure doesn't creep. It propagates at the speed of sound through the material, roughly 5,000 meters per second through acrylic. From the moment the crack begins, full breach takes less than a millisecond. The tick you heard? That was the beginning of the end. Second 0. The window doesn't shatter outward. It doesn't even shatter the way you'd imagine. At 15,750 pounds per square inch, the breach is less like breaking glass and more like a detonation. The seawater enters at approximately 1,500 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound in air. But here's where it gets worse. The air inside your submersible is at 1 atmosphere. The water rushing in is at 1,086 atmospheres. When those two pressures meet, when that column of seawater at near sonic velocity slams into the compressed air pocket of your vessel, the air doesn't simply get pushed aside. It auto-ignites. The rapid compression of air to extreme pressures generates heat through a process called adiabatic heating, the same principle that makes a diesel engine fire without a spark plug. At 1,086 atmospheres of compression, the temperature of that air spike is not measured in hundreds of degrees. It is measured in thousands. Your submersible, in the same millisecond that it implodes, also explodes. The hull collapses inward at approximately 2,200 feet per second. The complete structural collapse takes roughly 1 millisecond, 1,000th of a second. Your brain's fastest instinctual response to any stimulus is 25 milliseconds. The rational, conscious acknowledgement of danger is 150 milliseconds at best. You never process what happened. The signal traveling up your spinal cord, the one that should produce the thought something is wrong, never arrives. The nervous system that would receive it no longer exists. Death occurred 24 milliseconds before your brain could form the concept of death. But let's slow time down. Let's say, hypothetically, in the scientific interest of understanding, that the implosion happened incrementally rather than in 1 total millisecond. Let's watch what this pressure does to the body, system by system. Because the science of what happens to human tissue at this depth is genuinely unlike anything else in biology. The first casualties are the body's air-filled cavities, your lungs, your sinuses, the small pockets of gas in your gastrointestinal tract. Unlike liquid-filled tissue, muscle, blood, fat, Gas is compressible. It follows Boyle's law. Pressure and volume are inversely proportional. At 1,086 bars, your lung volume wouldn't compress gradually. It would eliminate. A lung holding approximately 6 liters of air at 1 atmosphere would be crushed to less than 6 milliliters at 1,086 atmospheres. The size of a grape. The alveoli, the 300 million tiny air sacs in your lungs responsible for gas exchange, rupture almost instantaneously. This is called pulmonary barotrauma, the tearing of lung tissue under extreme pressure differential. At recreational diving depths, this injury alone kills. At 11 kilometers, it's the least of your concerns. Your sinuses, the 4 hollow chambers in your skull, collapse inward. Your eardrums don't just perforate, they cease to exist as membranes. The tiny architecture of hammer, anvil, and stirrup that converts sound to neural signal is crushed flat. And here's where it gets worse. You might assume that blood, being liquid, would survive pressure better than air, and you'd be partially right. But at 1,086 bars, even blood behavior changes in catastrophic ways. The rupturing of your pulmonary capillaries, the microscopic blood vessels lining the alveoli, means seawater doesn't just flood the lungs. It enters the bloodstream directly. This is called pulmonary hemorrhage flooding, and it creates a phenomenon where your cardiovascular system is simultaneously overpressurized from outside and losing structural containment from within. Blood vessels throughout the body burst in a cascade. Every capillary, every arteriole, every venule in your body ruptures in sequence. Your blood pressure, in the traditional medical sense, becomes meaningless. There is no longer a pressurized circulatory system. There is just fluid, blood, seawater, and intercellular fluid all equalizing toward 1,086 bars. The nervous system is, by percentage, the most lipid-rich structure in the human body. Approximately 60% lipids. At extreme pressure, nitrogen, which under normal circumstances dissolves harmlessly in tissue at 1 atmosphere, becomes catastrophically soluble in fatty tissue. At the pressures of the deep, the phospholipid bilayers of every neuron, the microscopic membranes that allow your neurons to fire electrochemical signals, are physically compressed beyond their operational tolerance. Neurons don't misfire. They don't send pain signals. They simply stop functioning. The myelin sheaths, the fatty insulation wrapped around nerve fibers that allows signals to travel at up to 120 meters per second, are crushed into non-conduction. Your nervous system goes dark. Not the darkness of unconsciousness, the darkness of the permanent, irreversible cessation of electrochemical activity. The lights don't flicker off. They are physically dismantled. And here is the counterintuitive fact that almost no one expects. At 11 kilometers deep, your skeleton may be the last structure to fail. Bone is dense, calcium hydroxyapatite, crystalline structure, and largely incompressible. Studies on barotrauma biomechanics suggest that skeletal structures can remain structurally intact long after surrounding soft tissue has been pulped. In a full, instantaneous implosion, your soft tissue, organs, muscle, skin would be liquefied and incinerated simultaneously by the thermal spike of adiabatic heating. But in a theoretical gradual pressure scenario, the bones would persist as the last recognizable architecture of what was once you. Your femur, your tibia, the cage of your ribs, intact, suspended in an unrecognizable medium. This is what the ocean would keep. There's a moment in this scenario where, if you knew the physics, you might think, if I could just seal the crack in time. And that thought, that brief, rational impulse toward survival, is exactly what makes this scenario so uniquely terrifying, because the math of it is merciless. At 11 kilometers, your submersible is exposed to a pressure differential of 1,085 bar. The force exerted on a 10-centimeter crack in the viewport is approximately 108,500 newtons. The equivalent of 11 metric tons of force focused on a 10-centimeter line. No human hand can generate that kind of counterpressure. No sealant works in that time frame. No emergency protocol operates faster than the speed of sound through acrylic. The crack propagation from initiation to full breach under 1 millisecond. The response time of the fastest trained human reflex, 100 to 150 milliseconds, You are 100 times too slow. Every human who has ever lived is 100 times too slow. But here's where it gets worse. One final time. There is no you left to be too slow. By the time the possibility of response forms as a conscious thought in your prefrontal cortex, the event is not in progress. The event is complete. The wreckage is already settling at a rate of approximately 1.5 meters per second toward the seafloor, 11 kilometers below the surface. What this scenario actually reveals has nothing to do with the engineering of submersibles or the depth of the ocean. It reveals the precise boundaries of the human body as a biological system, not as a moral failure, not as a tragedy, but as a set of parameters, pressure tolerances, neural transmission speeds, lipid chemistry, gas compressibility, that define exactly how fragile the architecture of consciousness actually is. We build machines to extend those parameters. Titanium hulls, acrylic viewports engineered to fail inward, internal atmospheres held at 1 bar in a world pressing at 1086. And for the most part, it works. The terrifying part isn't the depth or the pressure or the darkness. The terrifying part is this. The only reason you're alive down there is a window. And windows have always been the thinnest thing between you and everything outside. The ocean doesn't know you're there. It was never waiting. It was just always pressing. If this kind of second-by-second science got under your skin, there's an entire library of scenarios on this channel where the human body meets forces it was never designed to survive. Every video is built on real biology, real physics, and zero exaggeration, because the truth, as you just witnessed, is terrifying enough on its own. Hit that subscribe button, because the next one is already waiting for you.